And so today we'll continue our discussion of analysis of variance, which we started on Monday. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain how we use ANOVA to partition the variance in both a single factor and a multi-factor ANOVA. And so what we're talking about there, on Monday, we had introduced basically one parameter of interest, one independent variable, which in that case was the depth of the rumble strips. And today we'll include a second factor as a part of that analysis. And so the same general methods are applied, but the steps in the process are a bit different in terms of how we try to determine how much of that variability is due to each of those various factors of interest. And this can be expanded further. As we move beyond two factors, it tends to become quite complicated and very tedious to try to do manually. And there are also a number of other methods that start to become superior to ANOVA for various reasons as we increase the number of independent or predictor variables of interest. But we'll talk through that. You'll be able to conduct both a one-way and a two-way ANOVA, and then we'll also circle back and talk about several tests. Actually, there's one test today that we can use to conduct a comparison of group means after we've determined that there is some difference within a group based upon the F-test, which is where we had wrapped up last time. All right. And so we'll start with a very brief review of what we talked about on Monday, and then we'll transition into the post hoc comparisons that are conducted after we've run through the initial ANOVA procedure. And then we'll introduce a general overview of two-way ANOVA. And then time permitting, we should still have a little bit of time for me to talk through the literature review a little bit. And so as a reminder, that would be due at the end of next week. And then assignment 3 would be due the following week. And then the week after is when we'll have our midterm exam, which as a reminder is going to be basically a one-day take-home format. So more details will be forthcoming over the next week on that as well. Okay. And so just circling back to what we had talked about on Monday, and I guess I should give you a heads up. I'm going to look for a little bit of interaction here just to help us kind of refresh our memory in terms of what was what from Monday's discussion. But at a very high level, what we're doing in ANOVA is we're taking the total variability that's being observed with respect to our dependent variable of interest. And on Monday, we talked about pavement noise as a consequence of that. And we're basically partitioning it into two groups. And so can somebody give us sort of a brief overview of what we're doing conceptually and what nature we're partitioning that data when we look at the fundamental identity here that our sum of squares total is equal to our sum of squares for the treatment plus the sum of squares for the error. Can somebody kind of walk me through that?
Okay, I think what we are doing is now we are trying to see how much there is variability between the treatment groups. For example, some of the treatments, right? So we are trying to compare that to the entire observation. Then for the sum of square of the errors, we are looking at the variability within each individual group and trying to see how much there's a difference between that.
Yeah, thanks, Falarin. So what we're trying to do essentially, we're assessing the total variability, and so that SST, the total sum of squares, is just the numerator that's used in our variance calculations. And so this is just quantifying the total variability within our sample, and more specifically, it's giving us just details, as the name implies, of what the sum of the squared differences of each of those observations is from the mean, okay? And so we're trying to determine how much of that variability is due to some tangible factor that we can relate back to our dependent variable. So in this case, we're trying to figure out how much of that variability in noise levels is a function of how deep the rumble strips are when they're being traveled over by a passing vehicle. And we're quantifying that by basically making comparisons between that overall mean, and that's the same term, the Y bar with the 2 dots means we're averaging across all J observations in each group and across both, or in this case, all 3 of the groups, the I's. And so this is basically accounting for how much of that variability is due to differences between that overall mean of the data and the means of the specific subgroups, okay? So in this case, we had 3 pavement groups, and if the means of each of those groups were equal to one another, for example, this quantity would tend towards 0, and consequently, all we would have remaining would just be random variability, okay, which is accounted for here, where we're taking the difference or the squared difference between each of our individual observations and its respective group mean. And so that essentially is just capturing random noise, uncertainty, the effects of unaccounted for factors as an example, okay? And so when we think about this conceptually, we are looking to determine whether or not this term, this sum of squares treatments, is providing a disproportionate amount of the variability in this overall total sum of squares. Or alternately, that this quantity for SS treatments is large relative to SSE. And just to refresh everyone's memory, does anybody recall why we put an N in front of the term here and why this looks slightly different in the second formulation? Does anybody recall that from Monday? So for each observation, we're taking the treatment mean of that specific group and we're subtracting off the overall mean and squaring that. And so why do we have the N out front?
I think we are multiplying that by the number of observations each in the group.
Correct, because if we think about this conceptually, every observation in one of those groups is going to have the same mean, right? So that mean would be observed n times within each of those respective groups. Likewise, they would all have the same overall mean, of course. And so basically this is just kind of a shortcut. And so we would, in this instance, just take that quantity and sum it within each of those groups. So across the 3 groups, and then we'd multiply by our corresponding sample size within the groups, which in this case would be equal to 4, okay? And so after we proceed through these calculations, we then culminate by taking those sums of squares and determining what our mean squares are as a consequence of that. And so we're taking each of those variance estimates, and we know that those are distributed as chi-squared variables, and the degrees of freedom are based upon the number of groups and or the number of observations within each of the groups. And so our sum of squares for the treatments, where we're comparing differences across the different groups, we're going to have A-1 degrees of freedom here. So for example, if we have 3 groups, we would have 2 degrees of freedom associated with that estimate. And in the case of SSE, that's basically going to be the number of degrees of freedom that are left over for us, in essence, is how we can think about that. And so we would have a total of capital N observations, which would be lowercase a times lowercase n. So in our case, we had 3 groups, 4 observations per group. And so capital N would be a total sample size of 12 sites in this case. And then subtracting off the 3 groups would leave us with 9 degrees of freedom. And so 2 plus 9 is 11, and that corresponds to the total degrees of freedom n-1, which, as you recall, is the same denominator we would see for our sample variance calculation, okay? And so we take these respective quantities and we present them in an ANOVA table, as we see right here. And I've included just the symbols and formula here, but we'd be plugging in actual numbers here as to what the sums of squares for the treatment, error, and total would be, along with their corresponding degrees of freedom. As we read across the table, our mean square is just going to be equal to our sum of square divided by the degrees of freedom in each case. So MS treatment is just SS treatment over A-1, and MSE is just SSE over N-A. And so we can basically think about these terms as general averages of that quantify how much of the variability is a function of each of those two sources of variation. And then the ratio of those two quantities, since both of these are chi-squared distributed variables, are distributed as an F statistic. And so we're basically taking MS treatment over MSE, which in a qualitative sense is telling us how much variability is systemic in nature and explained by the way we're separating those data in those observations into groups, divided by the amount of variability that's just random in nature. And so if we think about that in concept, smaller numbers here would imply, of course, that there's less difference between the groups, less variability is explained systematically. And so we would fail to reject the null in that case. And in contrast, as the amount of variability that's explained by our groups gets larger, this quantity is going to go towards the upper tail of that F distribution. And so this is a case where we're concerned only with a one-sided test and that upper tail. And we'd have to refer back to the critical F table. And you'll remember the F tables are structured such that we have one table for each level of alpha. So for example, if we use the table for alpha of 0.05, we would need to read across with numerator degrees of freedom of A-1 and denominator degrees of freedom of N-A, okay? And so just as a recap, if we think back to the noise data we had worked with on Monday, we had gone through and basically at the conclusion of the lecture made the determination that there was in fact a difference in noise levels across those respective groups because this F statistic was very large and the corresponding p-value was very small. But at that point, we just knew that at least one of those three group means was different from the others, and we weren't necessarily sure which was different, at least at a level that was statistically significant at, say, 95% confidence. And so to that end, we had talked about how there are a series of tests that can be conducted after the fact. Once we've determined that there is, in fact, a difference, we can use these post hoc tests, okay? And so to that end, just continuing on what we had just discussed there, so that F test, all that tells us is that there's a difference present somewhere with respect to those group means. And so subsequent to that, we use follow-up tests, which are also called multiple comparison tests. And so what we're doing from a big picture perspective here is based upon our ANOVA output and the variability that's shown with respect to our data, we're going to determine essentially like a limiting value. We can think of it analogous to an upper confidence limit in a sense. And if the differences between any pairs of means are greater than whatever that prescribed difference is, we would then be able to determine that there's a statistically significant difference between that specific pair of means, okay? And so to that end, we'll walk through one of the most widely used post hoc tests here, and that's Fisher's least significant difference, or also referred to as Fisher's LSD. And basically the way this test works, it's analogous to some of the t-tests that we had talked about previously, except now we're making use of the output from our ANOVA analysis. And so if we look at how this is structured, so LSD, so this is basically establishing a minimum difference in means that would need to be observed such that we could claim that they're significantly different from one another. And so this would be similar to, in the case of our normal t-test, x1 bar minus x2 bar, or whatever, the arbitrary which samples we're referring to there. But we can think about that, about the minimum difference that would have to be experienced between those respective means. And so likewise, this term right here, as you may be able to ascertain from looking at this, is analogous to the standard error that would be associated with that t statistic, okay? So MSE, again, our mean squared error is basically an estimate of the random noise and inherent variability that's present within that data set, okay? And since we're taking the variability across pairs of groups here, that's why you see a 2 here. It's just like in the case of our 2 sample tests. When we're comparing 2 random variables, we sum their respective variances. And so that's why we're doubling that MSE quantity here. And then we're dividing by n because here we're looking at pairs of differences. And so as a consequence here, if we compare this analysis procedure to just doing the independent sample t-test as we had talked about last time, the primary difference here is that we would have to observe larger differences in order to claim statistical significance. So we're trying to be more conservative here so that we maintain that probability of committing a type 1 error at a level of just 5%, okay? And so in determining the corresponding critical t-value here, we're generally going to conduct these as two-sided tests. So we'll take the value for t alpha over 2 with n minus a degrees of freedom. And as you'll recall, that's the same number of degrees of freedom that would correspond to the MSE term previously, okay? And so what we'll do now is just basically walk through that procedure. And so in our case, again, we had a total of 12 sites from which we had data. We had 3 groups, so we have 9 degrees of freedom. We're going to pull our corresponding t-value from the 0.025 column, and we're going to plug in our corresponding values of MSE and n from our preceding analyses, okay? And so that critical t-value is 2.262. The MSE, as shown on the preceding slides, was 1.72. And we have a total of 4 observations within each of our groups. And so our least significant difference is 2.10 decibels. And so now what we do is we can compare each of the 3 differences in group means. And if those differences are larger than 2.10, we can claim that there is a significant difference. If not, we don't have sufficient evidence to claim that there's a difference between that specific pair of means, okay? And so first of all, if we look at the first group versus the second group, where the first group is that with the smallest depth of rumble strips, in that case, we actually see a difference of 2.08. So we would have rejected this under our normal independent sample t-test procedures, but in this case, you'll notice we're just short of that threshold value. And so I should indicate here, this is obviously an absolute value because it's arbitrary if we're taking the mean from group 1 minus the mean from group 2 or vice versa. But in either case, that difference is not found to be statistically significant in this case. In contrast, if we look at group 1 versus group 3, in this case, we find a much larger difference of 7.73 decibels. And so we would claim that those means are significantly different from one another. And then lastly, depth 2 versus depth 3, as shown in the preceding calculations, that would give us a difference of 5.65 decibels, which would also be significant. And so what that means in effect is that group 3 is demonstrating higher noise levels than either group 1 or group 2, but there's not a significant difference between groups 1 and 2, okay? So in short, 2 of the 3 differences are significant here, but we can't claim, at least based upon our initial sample of data here, that there's a significant difference between those first 2 groups. All right, any questions on where we are up to this point? So it's a relatively straightforward application of some of the t-test methods that have been introduced previously. The context is just a little bit different. Okay. All right, we talked about this a little bit on Monday. So ANOVA does require a few assumptions to be satisfied on our end. And so those assumptions first are that those samples are independent of one another. And so if we think about the example we've been working with here, just trying to think out loud about things that could introduce violations of that assumption. If, for example, I guess we had 2 of those sites that were immediately adjacent to one another, perhaps that would be a circumstance where you may see some correlation in the noise levels. But by and large, the way this experiment was set up, that's not a particular concern. And so we think about this very similarly to what we would how we would proceed in determining if we should do an independent or dependent sample t-test. Okay, so if there's some reason to expect that some subsets of those groups are correlated with one another, and we could measure that, we could quantify that correlation, then there are alternative methods that we would want to look to. So that's an important assumption. Secondly, the assumption is that our data are going to be normally distributed, and we've shown for several examples, if that's not the case, we can see significant violations of the assumptions, and we can get erroneous test results and consequently erroneous inferences. And we have some non-parametric alternatives. There's a Kruskal-Wallis test that we won't get into in this class, but that would be an option we could use in that scenario. And then likewise, if our variances are not equal to one another, that introduces some additional concerns, as we had seen in our comparison of students versus Welch's t-test, for example. And so we would need to adjust the degrees of freedom in that t-test scenario, and it's a bit trickier in the case of ANOVA. And so in those instances, there are some alternative procedures that we won't get into for the context of this class, but generally speaking, ANOVA tends to be a fairly robust procedure. Okay, so like I said, in practice, these assumptions are usually not going to hold exactly. You may have marginal departures from normality. You may have some difference in variances, which is what we even experienced in this sample data set. As you'll recall, the variance got slightly larger as we went from group 1 to 2, and likewise from 2 to 3. But generally speaking, this is fairly robust, and these violations would have to be fairly severe. And I realize I'm not giving you very concrete evidence as to what constitutes that difference here. But generally speaking, we're safe in conducting ANOVA across a wide range of different data sets. Okay. Now, one interesting parallel here is, instead of, in the case where we're comparing two samples to one another, we could use our students or Welch's t-test in those scenarios, or we could use the same one-way ANOVA. Now, as it turns out, the one-way ANOVA is a bit more work, but I just wanted to give you a quick demonstration here of how those results compare to one another as we assess those two different methods. I would suggest you perhaps try to work through this outside of class. So the way I've traditionally done this when we meet in in-person settings is I would break you into groups, and each of your groups would work through a comparison of sample 1 versus sample 2, or 1 versus 3, or 2 versus 3, as the case may be. And we'd conduct the t-test and the ANOVA and compare those results to one another. Now, given the challenges that are introduced by a virtual environment, I'll leave that exercise to you outside of class, but I will walk through the general differences between those approaches here, okay? So as we had demonstrated previously, I'm just going to bring up the ANOVA results that correspond, first of all, to the comparison between groups 1 and 2. And so keep in mind, we had just determined when we were conducting the ANOVA that the difference between groups 1 and 2 was not statistically significant, right? Now, keep in mind that's because we were simultaneously comparing all 3 of those groups to one another. And so we were trying to minimize the probability of committing a type 1 error, which is inflated when we try to independently compare a series of differences using the same set of sample data, okay? But in this case, we're just basically assuming that these comparisons are operating completely independent of one another. This is just largely for demonstration purposes. And so this largely reinforces the result we had seen from the t-test, which had shown us a calculated value of negative 2.98, which of course we would reject the null hypothesis when we compare that to our corresponding critical value, whether students or Welch's. And interestingly, we'd find a p-value that's also equal to 0.02455 in that case. We'll circle back to this in a second here, but for group 1 versus 3, this is where we had seen the largest difference in mean noise levels, because obviously we had very high levels of noise in the third group, very small levels of noise, relatively speaking, in the first group. And so consequently, in that circumstance, we find that our F statistic is very large and our p-value as a consequence is very small. And that's consistent with what we see when we conduct our students' t-test, which shows a calculated test statistic of negative 8.23. And again, those results align very well with one another. And then similarly, comparing groups 2 to 3, since that second group is in the middle here, obviously we don't see as large of a difference, but we still do see in this case that F statistic is very highly statistically significant, and it's equal to 26.28, whereas the T statistic in this case is equal to 5.13. Now, let's take a quick look here. And as we look at the T statistics versus the F statistics, there's an interesting relationship between those variables here. Can anybody ascertain what that relationship is? So this is basically a unique result that applies only to this specific case where we're comparing two samples to one another. And as Jordan has alluded to, the F statistic is basically just the T statistic squared here. Okay. So it's kind of a unique artifact of the way these data are structured, because in the ANOVA analysis, keep in mind, we're comparing ratios of chi-squared distributed variance estimates. Whereas in the t-test case, we're comparing the differences to just that the variance, the average variance across those two groups. And so just in this unique circumstance, and this will return to some similarly interesting findings, we'll find that a lot of the tests we can use to assess similar hypotheses are related to one another in some form or fashion. And so this is just kind of an interesting artifact of the data here. So you'll find exact correlation between these respective methods. Okay, and we had a question come up that I'll handle now, related to some of my prior comments on some of the underlying assumptions that are required for ANOVA. And so one of those questions is, can ANOVA be used for paired samples? For example, if the 3 rumble strip depths are done on the same highway. And yeah, that's perfectly fine. We would be able to work through that in an analogous manner. The bigger concern, so if all 3 of the samples are correlated with one another, that's less of a concern, because what we need to think about is how we're partitioning the variance here, essentially. And so we're assuming that our error terms, for example, are independently and normally distributed with equal variance across the groups. And so if 2 of the groups here were on the same highway and the third was not, then we would have difficulty because we won't have a way to control for that potential common effect of those 2 sites being located along the same highway. Okay. So if they were all on the same highway, that would actually probably, if I were to guess, make our analysis more powerful in some circumstances, because a lot of those external factors, just the random noise, the random variability, that could be due to something that's location specific. Maybe it's near a heavy truck route or a forested area where just the acoustics are different. And so there'd be some advantage here for us to actually design that experiment in a paired manner. With that being said, it should also be noted, we would potentially have some concerns with that as well, because there may just be something unique about that site that would give us different results than if all those sites were sampled randomly from different areas. So maybe we just observe different relationships on that one highway, and I don't have a good idea, as I'm not an acoustometrician or whatever the term is in that case. But anyway, very long rambling answer there, apologies. But the short answer is, yeah, if all of our data are paired, we can proceed with ANOVA as normal. If they're not all paired, then some complications are introduced that would best be handled in an alternate manner. A second question that came up is just, well, what happens if that equal variance assumption isn't met? And the short answer to that is that we're simply going to be more likely to commit a type 1 error here in essence. And the reason for that, if you think back, it's very similar to when we compared the students' results to Welch's results. So we won't get different answers. The actual calculated values will be similar. But when we look at the underlying distribution of the F statistic, for example, we would tend to reject the null hypothesis incorrectly more frequently than we would. So essentially that error rate of 0.05 is inflated because as that differences and variances gets very large across the sample, it just introduces some challenges in our subsequent hypothesis tests that are applied. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and it sounds like it does, at least to the person who asked the question, so thanks for that. And then again, in this case, I would encourage you to at least get a little bit of practice here. We'll work through this on the third homework assignment, but it's relatively straightforward to go through the same exercise we had done on Monday using just any subset of those two groups, okay? All right, now we will ratchet up the intensity a little bit here, at least if we're looking to do these investigations manually. And so oftentimes we may be in situations where there's not one, but two different variables of interest that would potentially impact, for example, in our case, noise levels, okay? And so in that instance, our analysis procedure gets a little bit more complicated because we would want to be able to independently assess whether either of those independent variables has a significant relationship with the dependent variable. And since each of those variables may have an impact, it's also possible that we would see synergistic effects. So as our rumble strip depth gets larger, our noise levels went up, and maybe as our pavement type changes or as some other aspect of our testing procedure changes, we also see increases in noise levels. And then maybe when those two variables increase in combination with one another, we see some additional supplemental increases in noise levels, or maybe we see a little bit of a dissipating effect. And so if both of them increase, maybe the cumulative increase isn't exactly additive, maybe it tapers off to a degree, and we would refer to those synergistic effects as interactions. And so basically that means that each of the individual factors may have an independent influence on our dependent variable of interest, and then the combination of those factors may introduce additional impacts beyond each of their individual contributions. And then the final source of variation would just be that remaining unexplained error, which would just be captured as a part of our normally distributed error term, as we had seen in the case of the one-way ANOVA, okay? And so we'll return to the same example problem we had just worked through. Previously, we had depth data for rumble strips. And so we had 12 sites that were spread across 3 groups with 4 sites in each of the 3 groups. And we found that there were significant differences based upon the depth of the rumble strips. Now, in addition, we might presume that there's ambient baseline noise levels at each study location may also have an impact. So what I'm saying here is that maybe some of those locations are just inherently more or less noisy than other sites. And so that was one of the concerns we had when we conducted these studies initially. And so as a part of the test procedure, what we had done, and I didn't get into this in great detail on Monday, but the test results you had seen previously were instances where we had one of our student drivers travel directly across the rumble strip. So they're basically riding along the shoulder of the roadway on the side nearest to where the noise meter was located. And so to serve as a sort of controlling factor, we also had those students take some test runs basically where they just drove down the normal travel lane and they didn't cross over onto the rumble strip. And so what we basically have for comparison purposes then is we have noise levels when a vehicle is just driving normally down the highway, and then we have noise levels when a vehicle is traveling down the highway over the rumble strips, okay? And so we may expect that there's an effect of that baseline level. And so consequently, we are going to go through a slightly more sophisticated analysis as a course of our two-way analysis of variance, okay? And so what you see here, these data are identical to what we had introduced on Monday, with the one exception that we now have included this information about the baseline noise levels that were present at these sites when the vehicles were just driving normally along the roadway, okay? And so in subsequent lectures, we'll talk about this a little bit more. Now, given the nature of these data, there are some alternative approaches for dealing with this, and that would include things like ANCOVA, which is an analysis of covariance. And the reason I bring that up is because you'll notice in this case, we had grouped these sites into different groups based on depth, and that was relatively straightforward. Now, in this case, there's not necessarily an obvious mechanism by which we can group these sites into groups or categories based on that baseline noise condition. And so in subsequent lectures, we'll talk about some alternative approaches, but we can at least get part of the way there, and I'll demonstrate one approach here as we work through the sample data. So specifically what we're going to do in this case, I basically just looked at whatever the median noise levels were in our sample, and that basically occurred around 71 decibels, at least in terms of those baseline noise levels, okay? And so what we've done then, in this case, we have two factors of interest. We have the rumble strip depth, which has been divided into 3 different groups, and we also have different levels of baseline noise, and that's been divided into 2 groups, okay? And so what we've basically done in concept there is we've gone from 3 groups of interest to now 6 groups of interest. And so if we were to conduct independent sample t-tests, our error rate would get significantly larger, and it would take us a significantly longer time to be very laborious to calculate and work through those efforts. And so what we're going to do here is we'll show you how to conduct a high-level test just to determine whether either of these individual factors is a significant determinant of the noise levels, which are a primary dependent variable of interest again, okay? All right, and so it's probably easiest to start by just looking at these data graphically, okay? And so I didn't want this to get too cluttered, so I haven't included exact replicates of what we saw on Monday. But what we see here are basically our 3 groups based on rumble strip depth. And so our 4 data points are clustered as shown there. And then I've broken those up into the subsets based upon whether we were below 71 decibels or above 71 decibels. Now, as it turns out here, interestingly, we actually saw the peak noise levels tended to be a bit higher when those baseline noise levels were low versus high. We'll return to this point in a few minutes, but we didn't really have a great explanation for that fact, but as our analysis will show here subsequently, it turns out that those differences, and I don't mean to give you the conclusion at the start of the analysis as I'm doing here generally, but it turns out that that difference isn't going to be statistically significant. But as we look at the respective graphs here, what we're trying to do in essence is make a determination as to whether or not we see significant effects of either the baseline noise levels, which in our case would be indicated by relatively large differences between the orange and the blue bars, okay? And so in samples 1 and 3, we really don't see much of a difference there. In sample 2, it gets a little bit larger. And then in addition to that, we'd also be interested in comparing differences between the 3 depth groups as we had done last time. And so in that case, I've omitted the same bars here, but just like we had talked about last time, we could basically take the average of these 4 points, the average of these 4 points, the average of these 4 points, and then we would compare those collective differences within each of those individual factors to how much variability there was of each of these individual points from the overall mean, which is indicated by this solid line you see right here, okay? We had also brought up the case of interaction effects. And so what we would expect to see if the effects of rumble strip depth and baseline noise levels are independent of one another, if there's no interaction effect, we would expect to see parallel lines here. So the slope as we go from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 across the two different subsets would tend to be roughly parallel, okay? And it's tough to say just from looking at things, but in this case, I don't have particular concerns as to an interaction effect here, because what we're generally seeing is that the blue line is slightly above the orange line in all of these cases. And though we do see a bit of a larger difference here, I don't have any particular concerns, but we will demonstrate how we can test for that effect on a subsequent slide, okay? So this is just giving you a little bit of a big picture setup for what we're trying to do here in concept, okay? And so under a two-way ANOVA scenario, we change our analysis approach slightly. And as a starting point, we basically add a third subscript here. So now we have two factors of interest. We're going to assume that our baseline noise level, we'll call that our first factor. And so A in that case would be 2. We have one low level of baseline noise and a second high level of baseline noise. And the second factor of interest, factor B in this case, is going to be the pavement rumble strip depth that we had introduced previously. And so in that case, J, instead of referring to the observation number, is now referring to the sample number in terms of the rumble strip group. And that's going to range from 1 to 3 in this case. And then K is representing the sample size within each of those respective subgroups, okay? So in this case, there are 6 subgroups, each of a size 2, so N is equal to 2 at each pavement depth for each underlying noise level. Okay, so hopefully everybody's with me there. Calculation's the exact same as we had before. We're just taking each individual observation, taking its difference from the overall mean, squaring that quantity and summing it. But the math is just a little bit more complicated here because we're dealing with a larger number of factors and consequently a larger number of groups, okay? Now, we can partition that total sum of squares instead of into 2 component parts here into 4 different component parts, okay? So we have the sum of squares for factor A, or our baseline noise level. We have our sum of squares for factor B, which is our rumble strip depth. We have the sum of squares that would correspond to any interaction effect. And then lastly, we have our error sum of squares as we would have under all other circumstances, okay? Now it gets fun. So as we look to break this down into its constituent parts, I'm stepping through one factor at a time. So first of all, factor A, which in our case was that baseline noise level. Similar to what we had done in the one-way ANOVA, we're simply taking our corresponding means within each of those groups. So in this case, we would have the underlying average value, and apologies, I've not included it here on the chart, but that would basically be the average of all of the blue points versus the average of all of the orange points, and comparing the differences between the average noise levels in those baseline noise groups to this average value across the entire sample, okay? Secondly, in the case of the rumble strip depths, we're averaging across all observations in each of the groups, and we're also averaging across our low and high baseline noise levels. And this would be exactly as we had done last time. We would be taking the difference between these 4 data points, so the means within those pavement depth groups, and taking the difference between that mean value and the overall mean, and again, squaring that quantity, okay? The interaction term is a little bit more challenging to interpret here. And so what we're doing in this case, we're taking the means within each of the subgroups. So in that case, that would be our lowest level of fidelity. That would be the means that are actually demonstrated on this plot here. And from that, we're subtracting off the mean that corresponds to factor A, or the noise level, the mean that corresponds to factor B, or the rumble strip depth, and then we're adding the overall mean back in here. And it's tough to think through exactly what this is capturing just from looking at it, but if we think about our null hypothesis, Under our null hypothesis that all the group means are equal to one another, this converges towards 0, okay? And then what we'll tend to find here, interestingly, is as this term is going to tend to get large as variables A and B increase with one another, or conversely, if they're inversely related to one another, as one goes up, the other goes down. So that quantity will get large as these plots begin to diverge from parallel lines in terms of when we look at this two-way plot of the interaction effects, okay? And so that's what's being captured in this term right here. So generally speaking, if for any given observation, its noise level for factor A is relatively large and its noise level for factor B is also relatively large, or they're conversely, one's relatively large, one's relatively small, those differences would be reflected by what we see here in terms of how those are related to one another. And then lastly, our sum of squares for the error is just whatever's essentially left over after we've controlled for all of those other factors, okay? So we'd be looking at the means within each of these individual 2 observation subgroups from that overall mean, okay? And we can introduce some shorthand notation here to simplify the amount of summing that we'll need to do. So it should make sense if we're looking at factor A, our noise levels in this case, we would have 2 observations in each group, and we would have 3 depth measurements. And so that's a total of 6 observations. So 6 blue points and 6 orange points, as the case would be right here. Likewise, when we look at the rumble strip depths, in this case, we would be summing the total number of observations within those respective groups. And so we've got 3, we have a total of 3 rumble strip groups. And we also know that we have a total of 4 replicates within each of those groups, or 2 replicates within the subgroup. And so we would sum that term accordingly. And then likewise, in the case of the interaction term, we would be calculating this quantity within each of these respective subgroups. And so we would multiply just by the n, which in this case would be 2. So we'd have 2, 2, 2 for n in all cases. B is 3, A is 2. And that's just telling us how many replicates of the same numbers we're seeing. This will make a lot more sense as I demonstrate some of the calculations on the subsequent slide here, but hopefully everybody is still with me. And you can see how this starts to get very complicated. We can get into 3-way, 4-way ANOVA, and so forth. And what happens in those instances is we start to add 2nd order interaction, 3rd order interactions, and those are things that I can't even demonstrate graphically. We need to start looking at 3-dimensional plots and other interesting things. So taking in mind those equations, we basically have 5 different estimates of our variance in this context then. So we have our sum of squares for factor A minus 1 degrees of freedom, so just the number of groups, in this case, the number of noise levels minus 1. For factor B, the same situation. We have the 3 pavement depth, rumble strip depth groups that we'd seen previously. And so we have B minus 1 degrees of freedom for factor B. For our interaction term, we basically have the product of those 2. So A minus 1 times B minus 1, which in our case would simply be 1 by times 2, or 2 degrees of freedom. And then whatever is left over is then attributed to our sum of squares of error, which in our case is going to be equal to A times B times n minus 1, okay? Our 2 times 3 is 6, and we would have just the sample size of 2 within each of the subgroups. So we'd have 6 remaining degrees of freedom for our error sum of squares. And if we sum each of those 4 quantities up, those would basically add up to our total sum of squares, which would, as always, have our capital N minus 1 degrees of freedom, which in our case would be A times B times N minus 1, or 2 times 3 times 2 minus 1, okay? All right, and so as we've done in the preceding cases, we can simply use F statistics to calculate our mean squared errors to determine whether or not there are significant differences due to any of these factors. And so first of all, In the case of factor A, we're just taking our sum of squares for factor A divided by its corresponding degrees of freedom, divided by our error sum of squares and its associated degrees of freedom, which alternately is just our mean square for factor A divided by our mean squared error. Calculations analogous for factor B, and so we're just taking our mean square factor B divided by our mean squared error. And then lastly, we do the same thing with the interaction term. So the sum of squares for that interaction divided by its degrees of freedom, which is A minus 1 times B minus 1, all over SSE, or just our mean squared for the interaction divided by the mean square for our error. Okay. And so at this point, this is what all of those respective quantities would look like in our standard ANOVA table. So we'll typically conduct separate evaluations for factor A, factor B, and the interaction effect. And then we would compare those respective mean squares to the mean square for the error term, okay? And so as we had done previously, what we're essentially doing here is we're just partitioning that variability, and we're saying relative to just the overall general noise that's inherent in the process here, as the amount of systemic variability within these groups, or based upon the interaction between these groups, as those quantities get large relative to the error term, we're going to have more evidence that there's actually an effect there, which would serve to refute or reject our null hypothesis. Okay. All right. And so ultimately, we're testing a series of hypotheses simultaneously. First of all, we want to determine whether the first independent variable has a significant influence on our noise level in this case. So whether or not the baseline noise had a significant influence on the peak noise levels. Secondly, we look at the impacts of whether our independent variable number 2 has an influence. And so in this case, it would be the pavement depth, the rumble strip depth we had talked about previously. And then thirdly, whether there was any combined or joint effect of those two variables taken in combination. Okay. And so I'm throwing a whole lot of information at you here, but what this basically is just an Excel table I have thrown together to try to walk you through the sequence of calculations that we would conduct in order to work through a two-way ANOVA, okay? And so I've separated this table into two groups, first of all, based on factor A, which was our baseline noise level. So this is the group of sites that have baseline noise levels below 71 decibels. This is the group of sites that have baseline noise levels above 70 decibels. And so that's going to be factor A in our circumstance, basically the calculation we're focusing on right here. If we look at the y bar sub I dot dot, keep in mind, this is basically representing what the mean levels of noise are within each of those baseline noise groups. So we see the same value for each of these 6 observations as we see for each of these 6 observations. And that's basically reflected by the fact here that we have 3 depth groups, 2 observations per depth group within each of those noise levels. And so we see 6 replicates in each of these instances, okay? And so that's capturing the difference in mean noise levels between the low and high baseline noise groups. We can tell just by looking at these that that's not a particularly large difference, obviously. So it's just basically a 1 decibel difference. And so the overall average noise across all 12 sites, so that y dot dot dot, meaning we're just averaging across all groups and all observations, is going to be 80.97 decibels. And so that's just the overall mean again of our data. And so that SSA term, which is the first quantity you see right here, we're just taking the mean of that respective group minus the overall mean, squaring that quantity, and then we end up with the same value. Interestingly, since we only have 2 factors in this case, that's why we see the exact same value for all 12 cases, okay? And similarly, as we move on to factor B, which is our rumble strip depth, these numbers should hopefully look familiar. And you'll see these values are common within the same depth group. So anywhere you see a depth group of 1, we see the 77.7. When we see a depth group of 2, we see the 79.78, and then likewise in the deepest rumble strip depth group, we see a mean decibel level of 85.43. Okay. And so we take each of those quantities and we subtract off the overall mean, as you see right here, and that is going to occur a total of 4 times. So in this case, we have 2 observations per each of the rumble strip groups and 2 noise levels per each of the rumble strip depth groups. And so consequently, we'll see 4 replicates then of 10.67, 4 replicates of 1.42, and 4 replicates of 19.88. Okay. And then the interaction terms. So these are going to be unique for each of the subsets of the data. So we'll have only the 2 replicates. And so this would just simply be the average within factor A and within factor B. This is simply the average of those 2 noise measurements. So in this case, 77.4 and 78.5 gives us an average of 77.95. And so we see pairs of means here that correspond to that finest level of fidelity. So this is as deep down as we can drill to get into the smallest subset of the data in this case, okay? And so we look at those individual subgroups versus the means of the larger groups from which they are drawn. And so from that, we calculate our SS for the interaction term. And so we'll notice that those values are again going to be paired, generally speaking, within these respective subgroups. An interesting nuance here, because we only have 2 levels of this factor, so that's an artifact. If we had more than 2 levels, we wouldn't see this symmetry where we actually see the same SSAB for these pairs. So just want to bring that up so you won't universally see that in all instances. And then whatever's left over once we've accounted for the other sources of variability is the random error, okay? And so that is as shown here. And again, in this case, this is just kind of an artifact of the data set. There's no inherent reason we would expect to see the same values in all 4 cases here. We would generally expect to see the same error sum of squares in pairs as we're seeing here, and that's only because we have 2 observations within those subsets. So as it gets larger, we're not necessarily going to see these same phenomena. And in any case, we sum up each of those 4 respective sources of variability. So factor A, factor B, the interaction, and the error term, and that will sum up to our total sum of squares. I would very strongly recommend, if you're doing this by hand, that you manually calculate SST and then also check that by adding the various constituent parts, because I can vouch that as a student and faculty, I've made numerous mistakes in working through the very tedious calculations that are required to work through a 2-way analysis of variance, okay? So we've gone through, we've done all of the necessary intermediate calculations, and then this basically results in the ANOVA table that you see right here, okay? And so first of all, that baseline noise level, now I had kind of given away the conclusion again a few slides ago, but no surprise here. We didn't really see a big difference between the blue line and the orange line in terms of where those mean noise levels were among the low noise and the high noise sites. And so we'll find that F statistics relatively small. We don't have sufficient grounds to reject the null hypothesis. In the case of factor B, we see a much larger impact, and consistent with what we had seen previously. This is basically showing us that the rumble strip depth continues to have a strong impact. We would reject the null, claim that there is a relationship, and then we need to conduct a series of follow-up tests as we demonstrated at the start of today's lecture. And then also we're looking at the interaction effect, which in this case tends to be very small as well. That's not statistically significant. And so one thing we can and may do in this case is basically ignore the interaction effect at this point. And so we could run through the same analysis and just basically spare ourselves of the interaction step there. And that would then just get pooled into the error term here, okay? And conceptually that would make sense because that's not having a very large increase in our error sum of squares our corresponding calculation, then we would take these mean squares divided by the sum of those respective quantities, for example. But that's just an aside. So occasionally, and that's particularly true as we get to three-way or four-way ANOVA, because if you look at third order interaction effects or fourth order interaction effects, so for example, if we have a low baseline noise level and we have a large pavement depth and we have asphalt pavement conditions, and then we have a fourth condition that I can't even think of off the top of my head now. As you start to drill down to that level of detail, it's really difficult to determine how that combination of 3 or 4 factors is going to have an influence. And what we'll tend to find is that those higher order interactions tend not to contribute a lot. And so again, that interaction is basically determining whether some subset of combination of factors has a pronounced influence, which in this case, it just simply doesn't, okay? Now, I thought it would be interesting for us to compare the differences between the one-way and the two-way ANOVA. And so if you think about this in concept, our total sum of squares is always going to be the same, right? No matter which way we slice up our data set into groups, we still have the same total amount of variability that we're aiming to partition, okay? And interestingly, if you remember back to the way we had calculated these different quantities, we find that the main effect for factor B in this case, which was the only factor we were looking at in our one-way analysis, that calculation is again the exact same as well, and its corresponding mean squared is the same as well. And so really what's happening here, and hopefully this becomes evident as we look at this, as we add factors to our analysis, what we're essentially trying to do is better explain the nature of the variability in our data set. And so that 15.48 sum of squares that was previously attributable just purely to random error is now the sum of the effects that are due to the baseline noise level, plus that interaction effect between baseline noise and rumble strip depth, and then whatever's left over for that remaining random error, okay? And so what'll happen by consequence, as we add factors to our model, we'll universally see decreases in our error sum of squares, and by consequence there, we'll also see changes in our mean square. However, I should note that as we add factors to our model, what will tend to happen is that's going to eat up some of the degrees of freedom that are attributable to our error term, okay? Now, why is that important? Keep in mind, for each of these individual f-tests, we're comparing the mean squares for these individual factors to the mean square for the error. And so in a case where we have 12 observations, if we're looking at 2 different factors, that really slices down the sample size significantly. If we were to try to add a third factor, that would slice that down even further, and we wouldn't have a sufficiently large sample in order to really demonstrate significant differences across some of those other ancillary factors that we're adding here. And so that reflects back, that was one of the reasons I brought up my point on the preceding slide, where if the interaction term isn't actually statistically significant, if that isn't showing us any sort of meaningful impact, it's to our advantage to essentially just ignore it, which the data would support that decision in this case, because that makes our sum of squares term larger, which in theory means we have greater variability, but that's compensated by the increase we'd see in our degrees of freedom. And so in this case, we'll notice, so it's important to understand the nature of these F statistics. So it's basically capturing the amount of variability due to the treatments as compared to all the other variability that we're accounting for here, okay? And so if we add factors that aren't meaningful, and so similarly in this case, we could support removing effect A because it doesn't look like that baseline noise level has an impact as well. And so as we remove those insignificant factors, what happens is that we just revert back to our one-way ANOVA ultimately, okay? And so that is a relatively quick introduction to two-way ANOVA. We have a little bit of time left, and so the next few slides just talk very briefly about the lit review, and so I'll try to get through these real quick and then have just a few minutes for any questions. I guess if you have any, feel free to type those into the chat box as we go. But my goal for the weekend is to catch up on a lot of grading after I get a few reports out the door that are due this week. And so at the end of next week, then we're basically looking for you to take the introduction you've written up to this point and expand on that by conducting a more extensive literature review within your specific topic area of interest, okay? And so when we're conducting literature reviews, what we're trying to do is synthesize everything that's known about that topic that we're investigating. And why is that important? Basically, it helps to provide context for your study. So why is this important? What do we already know about this topic? What don't we know about this topic? And how can we further the collective knowledge we have based upon the results of our study, okay? So we want to be able to look to similar research topics. And so I've talked previously, let's say we're doing a study on motorcycle safety. So motorcycle safety is a very broad topic in and of itself. And so consequently, that lit review could be quite extensive. And I'm aware of a few what we'll refer to as systematic reviews, which are basically very extensive literature reviews that are meant to summarize every meaningful piece of literature on a topic. And so these documents can be hundreds of pages in length. And so I don't want to scare you. I'm certainly not looking for that, but within the context of the term paper, we're at least trying to provide an overview of the big picture with respect to this topic of interest. And then more importantly, want to determine, well, where are there things that we don't know? Where are there opportunities where the analyses that we can conduct can help us to better explain some aspect of that topic, okay? So that's just a big picture setup. There are a variety of different resources that can be used to search through transportation literature. Many of you may use Google Scholar, for example. I find it tends to have some significant gaps, particularly in transportation. It misses conference proceedings. It misses a lot of technical reports. And so I would encourage you, as you look to conduct your literature review, my starting point would generally be the TRID database, so the Transportation Information Research Database. And there are a variety of other sources as well that would be useful. And so these are largely provided just for context. So as an example, TRB maintains a database of research in progress that would include NCHRP reports, as well as any or ongoing NCHRP projects or any active state DOT projects. But that's maintained basically through correspondence with the states. So I know that some states are better or worse than others in terms of updating that information in a timely manner. But if you're curious about what's ongoing presently across the country, you can use that resource. And then there are a few other portals that have been developed by various organizations that provide additional insights and resources. But for our intents and purposes, I'd focus primarily on the TRID database, okay? There are also a few expanded searches that have been developed using Google that help us to narrow in on specific subsets of documents. So like I said, Google Scholar by itself has some limitations, but interestingly, there's been some search work that's been developed that allows us to narrow in specifically on transportation and state DOT publications. Again, I don't think it has quite the breadth of coverage that TRID would have, but you will potentially find some interesting things through these more targeted searches that you wouldn't find otherwise, okay? And so as you work through the literature review, what we'll want you to do is, I would suggest you scan the abstract. It's usually fairly quick to determine. So let's say we're focusing on motorcycle safety, as I had alluded to. You can quickly scan through and see what exactly was done, what the primary contributions or findings of the research were, and at least in some qualitative sense, assess how important that is. If it looks like a study that has important insights or that would be very closely related to what you're investigating, then I would suggest you proceed to read through the article. Generally, I'd start by looking at the introduction and or the conclusions. And you don't need to go through all the nitty gritty until and unless you determine that that's something that is pertinent. And so ultimately for your literature review, your list of references that you use should be sufficiently comprehensive. So I very carefully added the qualifier here. We don't need you to review every piece of literature on your topic, because that wouldn't be fun for you as a writer or me as a reader, to be frank. And that would vary very widely by topic area. So in some cases, cable median barrier, for example. So I'm aware of maybe between a half dozen and a dozen studies or papers on that specific topic, and several of those have been authored by myself and some of my colleagues. And so that's an area where you could probably put together a pretty concise one page that gives you a good sense of what's been done in that area. If we look at something very broad, like just motorcycle safety, and we could be talking about hundreds of articles. And so you just want to make sure that you provide a sufficient level of detail there and you don't overwhelm yourself. And I know somebody will inherently ask, well, what's an appropriate number of references? And I always cringe at such questions, but I'd say let's try to target 10 or so as a starting point. If you have 50, I don't need you to read through 50, but I would encourage you to try to identify which of those articles or research reports would be either most pertinent or of highest quality. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole right now for the sake of time, but there's a lot of research out there that's very good. And there's also a substantive body of literature that doesn't add a whole lot necessarily. And so when we think about what constitutes a quote unquote good article, that would include things like that article coming from a good journal. Now, you probably don't have necessarily the knowledge of the field that you can discern at this point what constitutes a good journal. We can look at metrics like impact factors, for example, but a general rule of thumb, at least in our field, is that if the article is published in a peer-reviewed journal, like the Transportation Research Record, it's generally of higher quality than a paper that's just published in a conference proceeding. So like the Transportation Research Board annual meeting proceedings as an example. If it makes it into the journal, it's loosely speaking better in quality, or at least judged by a group of reviewers of being higher in quality, okay? And so just the thing to think through. And then also, if your topic is something that's germane to design, there are NCHRP reports and other resources that would potentially be better reflected than research articles. But I can help you to work through some of those examples. And then as you review each of the individual articles, are typically structured in a very similar manner. And so, like I said, I'd start with the abstract, intro, and conclusions. Some of the other areas may provide additional useful insights, but most of the key findings that are contributing to the body of knowledge would be included between the abstract, the intro, and the conclusions, okay? And so as you review each of those, what we're basically trying to do is tell a story such that the reader understands who did what, where, when, and then what those contributions were ultimately, okay? So we would expect the traditional way this is often done, you'll have a short paragraph that summarizes each of those individual studies. The reading can get somewhat formulaic. So my personal preference is to group studies topically. And so if we're focusing on something like motorcycle safety, we'll have a paragraph that talks about the effects of helmet use laws, for example, and another paragraph that talks about the effects of drinking and riding, and so forth and so on, okay? And so those are the general things we're focused on. It's also important to note, so the authors should hopefully disclose any limitations of their studies, which could be due to data they didn't have available to them, or some other factor that inhibited them from doing the study exactly the way they would have liked. But that's perhaps is equally important as what the actual results were, as what some of the limitations were. And so as an example, this is just a quick review that was included in part of a helmet use paper that I had authored probably 10 years ago now at this point, nearly. And so this talks about an Iowa study that had been done on helmet use by Nadia Grishka. And so I start out by basically saying what was done. So there was a helmet use study that was done through direct roadside survey. I talk about when the survey was conducted, and when. So in the state of Iowa, using data from a 7-year period, and then highlight what the big picture findings were. So 36 to 39% helmet use rates. I get into the methods a little bit. Now, this will be challenging for you at this stage. So I think we're probably comfortable if you just say what type of method they use, that's fine. You might not necessarily understand what that method is, but bivariate probit models were estimated, and we looked at effects of these lists of factors. And then we go through and detail what the key findings of that analysis were ultimately, okay? And so this is just one example. And so I'd look for you to basically stitch together 10 or so examples like this. And so we're probably looking at another maybe 2 pages to 3 pages on the high side here. And keep in mind, you've already framed some of this in the introduction. So your introduction content might include some of those, that minimum I'm looking for there. You also want to make sure you appropriately reference your source. It drives me crazy when I have to fix references. And so there are a wide range of different resources, and there's a link to TRB's reference guide provided here. And you can, through a quick Google search, find a number of different sources that detail reference formats, okay? So that again is due at the end of next week. I will try to get you some feedback on your topic over the weekend, so you at least have a little bit of feedback there, but that shouldn't really impede you from continuing on with the broader literature review. And then assignment 3 will be posted in short order as well, and that will get into ANOVA and also a start of linear regression, okay? And so with that, that wraps up all the content I had for today. Do we have any questions from the audience at this point? So from our perspective, in terms of what my expectations would be in your ability to apply analysis of variance, I think being able to do a one-way ANOVA manually is critically important. Anything beyond one way, I would suggest you're wasting your time. Well, I don't want to belittle it, because I've done it numerous times myself, but anything beyond one way, I think is best done using a software program, and that's in part just due to the complexity associated with that. Falarna, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I have a question about the one-way ANOVA. So when you were doing the one-way ANOVA, right, you did not include, you only included the treatment sites there. So you were comparing one treatment group to the other. I was just wondering what benefit that gives us in terms of knowing which treatment is effective.
I'm not sure if I'm interpreting your question correctly, but so are you just asking for the one-way ANOVA? Can you elaborate on that? Go ahead.
Yeah, so for the one-way ANOVA, I believe we had maybe three different treatment groups, right?
Yeah.
So we're comparing the treatment groups to each other. So what benefit does that give us in terms of knowing if, say, that particular treatment is effective, or, I mean,
okay, I think I get where you're coming from on this. So in this case, in the one-way ANOVA, our fundamental question was, does the depth of the rumble strips make a difference, right? And so we basically, our conclusion was, well, yes, it does. And then the question is, well, how big of a difference? And so we found that there was a marginal difference between groups 1 and 2. Okay, that wasn't statistically significant. It was really close. I mean, if we had another replicate, another site in each of those groups, we may have seen a significant difference there. But in any case, that difference was relatively small in magnitude. It wasn't statistically significant. But if we compared the third group, and I'm trying to remember, that would have been anything above, was it a ½ inch, I think, in depth? We saw significantly higher levels of noise than in the 2 lower depth groups. And so in that case, our primary conclusion from that study was that we shouldn't mill rumble strip depths beyond a ½ inch. is kind of the short of it, because once you get beyond a half inch, those noise levels tend to increase by a substantial amount. Okay. And so that's actually MDOT's rumble strip policy at present, I think, is 3/8 of an inch plus or minus 1/8 of an inch. So practically speaking, it's from a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch. And so hopefully that's answering your question. So I guess, you know, in some cases we could use ANOVA to compare 10 or 12 or 20 groups to one another, right? And so even if we find differences among those groups, we ultimately, I think what you're driving at there is, well, how is this useful? What's the conclusion, and how does this help to inform things? It's kind of, hopefully I'm speaking for you, but hopefully that's kind of in line. And so when you're comparing those groups of means, you're kind of looking for some commonality or some basis that would lead to a recommendation of some sort. So in this case, it was fairly straightforward in that, you know, there was a certain level beyond which noise would become a particular problem. The other thing we could think about is what those differences mean in practical terms. And so I'm a couple minutes over time, so my apologies, but I don't know how familiar all of you are with noise levels generally. But when we talk about a 10 decibel level increase, that's basically a doubling of the noise level. Okay, so it's measured on a log scale. And so in this case, I think as we went from the smallest to the largest, we saw upwards of 7 decibels, which from a practical standpoint, that's starting to be a pretty significant difference. So we're concerned both in whether those differences are statistically significant and practically significant. So with all that talking, did I answer your question, Falarin?
Yes, you did. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you.
Oh, and then real quick aside, do you guys want me to keep this subsequent discussion in on the videos? I'm assuming so. I guess you can always stop watching if you're not interested, but I guess my plan will be to include this just because I think some of this subsequent discussion is generally useful as well. So anyway, any other questions from anybody?
And I have a small question.
Yes, Nishal.
So instead of doing one-way ANOVA, can't we directly go for Fisher's LHD? I mean, that would also tell us which groups are different.
Oh, great question. I guess we could. How has that question not come up before? And in the many times I've taught this. So I guess if we think about the origin of these methods, these were all done by hand by brilliant people in the 1950s and earlier in some instances. And so at a fundamental level, I guess my response to that would be, if you're doing it manually, there are generally advantages just testing whether or not there's a difference. But I guess to your broader point, I don't even know how much the time savings would be from that standpoint. So with modern computing, it's all kind of a moot point, because we would basically, you know, you'd run the ANOVA and you could select which specific comparison tests you'd like to conduct concurrently to that. But yeah, to your broader point, I guess we could, I need to think about that a little bit more, but yeah, I mean, in concept, you could just move directly to the LSD test step, you know, I mean, functionally, I think it's useful, you know, if nothing else, I think it's useful to understand the ANOVA process, because that process is going to become important in linear regression and various other forms and fashions. But in the case of comparisons of sample means, I guess, yeah, to your broader point, Nishal, I don't want to say you're making me feel like I've wasted your time for 2 days now here with my lecture. So hopefully that's not the big takeaway from here. But yeah, so yeah, from just a practical perspective, you're correct in that there's not a compelling reason, because if you reject through Fisher's LSD, it would correspond to that same ANOVA test result. So I don't know what I would have covered the last 2 days of lectures with, though, in that context. But no, in all seriousness, very good question. Any other questions from the audience? Okay, if not, sorry again, we're 5 minutes over. I will get these up later this afternoon. I've got a series of meetings until about 2:30, so it'll probably be late afternoon at that point. But thank you very much and have a good one.